Great, let's resume, please. And it's my great pleasure now to welcome you to the concluding panel of the day, Preserving and Fostering Digital Trust, the Way Forward. And going by the discussions we've had so far, I think that's the hard part. Let's see what we can do here. I must say, just looking back at the day, I've rarely been at a conference where we had so many Hollywood celebrities show up, fake, all of them, of course. But if you think of it, we had Leonardo DiCaprio talking to us. We had Salvador Dali resurrected from the grave. It was quite impressive, and I think it did show the spectrum of possibility and what the technology can do already. So I do think I have to correct my earlier statement when I said that the innovations dialogue is about over-the-horizon technologies. Just looking back at the discussions now, it seems to me that this is very much an around-the-corner technology that is already very much up on us. So it is urgent and about time that we get talking. Now, we touched upon some of the benefits that the technology underpinning deepfakes can have, but certainly most of our discussions focused on the risks and the downsides that it can have, the disruptive impact. And we have seen how deepfakes can be used as part of social engineering strategies, how they can be aligned with wider social trends, and that makes them particularly impactful, and they can amplify already existing distrust in institutions and governments. Surely we've mentioned the COVID-19 context in which we've seen what false information can do. And just one example, of course, is the widespread reluctance to adopt any contact tracing apps in various populations. And I think we've also seen how deepfake technology, if it's combined with micro-targeting and spear phishing, can be particularly impactful. Just one example from 2019 where the voice of a CEO was impersonated in such a realistic way that an employee transferred 200,000 euro to another account thinking that he was doing this ordered by his boss, but in fact he wasn't. So all of this was quite impressive, and I think if anything the discussions today have left no doubt that the international community now urgently needs to prioritize issues of digital trust and security, and that we need to take concrete steps to protect and promote shared standards of truth if we want to harness the transformative benefits of the digital revolution. Now, the discussion at this panel and the concluding discussion of the day will explore what digital trust actually entails and how it can be preserved and fostered. And I think that is a tall order. If you think of trust in a general sense and outside the digital domain, it's such an eternally relative concept, elusive certainly to a certain degree. It has layers of psychology and emotional dimensions. It's inherently hard to earn and even harder to grasp, I find. And though it is still part of everyday life, it's essential for human interactions. You go to your bank and there is an element of trust involved. If you see your doctor, there is an element of trust involved, and so on and so on. So we'll now explore what that can mean in a digital context. And I'm truly delighted that we have a great lineup of speakers with us for this panel. And they really need no introduction, so I'll keep it very short. First, we have Izumi Nakamitsu, the UN High Representative for Disarmament. She's joining us virtually from New York. Amandeep Singh Gill is here with me in Geneva, Director of IDARE, International Digital Health and AI Research Collaborative. And Kaya Sieglitsch is joining us online. She's the Senior Director of Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft. Unfortunately, Nina Schick, who was supposed to join us, will not be able to be here this afternoon due to an unforeseen situation. Now, I'll kick things off with a question to all of our panelists, and perhaps Izumi, you can then be the first to answer. And actually, it's a bit of a set of questions. So what does digital trust actually entail, and why is it important? The Secretary General spoke of a global trust deficit, but how does this lack of trust actually manifest itself in the digital domain? And does the notion of trust differ at the individual, societal, institutional, and intergovernmental level, and how would such a lack of it manifest itself at these different levels? Izumi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. It's great to be here, even though I'm joining from New York. I wish I was there with you. Obviously, I have a deep trust and confidence in everything that Unity does, so it's a pleasure to be with you, participating in this exchange of views at this panel. Now, I think growing digital hyperconnectivity, if you will, and its really varied dimensions mean that trust and openness need to be fostered on many levels, many different levels, and also across many different relationships in order to promote an open, secure, stable, accessible, and of course, peaceful ICT environment for everyone. And I think, in your opening remarks and some of the discussions that I captured in earlier sessions really point to those important aspects. And there are different notions, of course, of trust in the digital domain. For instance, there is the trust which, of course, the users have to have in a system. The user needs to be able to trust that the network they are on and the software that they're using will support their need to communicate with the person they intend to communicate with, while, of course, ensuring that the privacy they expect to maintain. And, of course, this there is increasing concerns that security and integrity of personal data really need to be prioritized. Now, second dimension, of course, there is the trust in the relationships between individual citizens, the private sector, and their governments. It is important for citizens to be able to trust that their government will protect their interest in cyberspace. This will be key in the challenge of striking the right balance, if you will, between national security and privacy concerns, as I mentioned. And then, of course, third, there is the trust in state-to-state relationships. And this is, of course, the focus of our work at the United Nations so far in the peace and security context. This has been addressed through, as you know, 6 groups of governmental experts and an open-ended working group and a new group, which has just started its work. The aim has been to bring states together to build trust and consensus amongst them. Why is this important? Why is trust important? And it's because the lack of overall trust is leading us all to fragmentation, which of course has dire consequences in the digital space and can also potentially result in the escalation of tension and conflict. And all stakeholders, as well as states, need to come together to make sure that this is avoided at all cost. Now, there is a great quote from Secretary General Antonio Guterres about war and peace. He said, "War is never inevitable. It is a matter of choice, and often it is a product of easy miscalculations. Peace, too, is never inevitable. It is the product of hard work, and we must never take it for granted." So I would definitely apply this quote. We have to really work very hard to make sure that we will be fostering trust and therefore avoiding potentially catastrophic consequences in the digital space.
Thank you, Izumi, and thank you in particular for pointing out that this is going to be quite a process and hard work, as you say. It's going to be continuous, and I fully agree. And thank you also for disentangling these different layers so clearly for us. I think in some of the previous discussions there was a rather strong focus on the user perspective and in commercial applications and so on. And I think we still have a way to go to really explore what the trust deficit and lack of trust and the rebuilding of trust in the interstate dimension can actually mean. Now, Amandeep, over to you. And the same question, what is digital trust? What does it entail? And why is it so important?
Let's thank you, first of all, Robin, for this opportunity. Pleasure to be here. Let's take the COVID-19 pandemic. So why is trust important? And how is it important at different levels, not just at the user level? So if we do not trust the data that's coming to us as policymakers, as respondents to this crisis, then we cannot plan the allocation of resources from hospital beds to vaccines. If we cannot engage our citizens in a trustworthy manner, so more than trust, it's the notion of trustworthiness. And we've seen that across different countries, there are different levels of trust in governments. So when governments ask citizens to do something, if they don't trust the rationale, the basis for those decisions, then obviously their cooperation is going to be less than enthusiastic, and that has consequences. So at different levels, you see this importance of trust. At the international level, interstate level, we have the need for alerting the world to outbreaks. So if we do not trust the data that another state or a region passes on, then obviously our actions are going to be less than optimal. In the future, I mean, we've set ourselves targets for being able to respond to pandemics in a different manner. So rather than 300 plus days that has taken us to develop vaccines, we want to do this in 100 days. We want to be able to pinpoint where the outbreak begins, so that day zero, our race to get the right diagnostics and vaccines begins at the right point in time. Now, if we can't do that through data sharing, through bringing unusual data sources, usual data sources from across human, animal, and planetary health, then we are not going to be able to respond in a good way. So trust is fundamental to our future responses to health emergencies. And this is just one example where it's become so deeply important. And why do we say digital trust? Because data, information is increasingly digitized. It is available to us, it's presented to us in digital form. So these two notions have sort of become fused in our collective consciousness.
Thank you very much, Amandeep. And I take it from the intervention so far that none of our panelists up to here is advocating a post-truth kind of scenario where we would ascribe a lower value to trust potentially in our relations. Quite the contrary, I take it, and I share that point. Now over to you, Kaya.
And thank you. Also, that would be terrifying. So I really hope that none of us think that a post-truth environment where we can just all make up stuff is something that we should strive for. But thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. And thank you, Robin, actually, too, for posing some fairly challenging questions. I think I must admit I went down a rabbit hole thinking about this one, just trying to understand, not understand, but almost clarify in my head, what is the difference between digital trust and just normal trust, and how does it manifest itself across the different stakeholder levels, as Izumi has so well explained and sort of categorized. And at the end of the day, I think I've come down on the point that trust is fundamentally a human emotion, and it then kind of, as we operate within these larger organizations, obviously it adds different layers and different different aspects to it. But clearly, there should be no difference between how we treat it digitally or how we treat it in the real world. For me, it's a foundation to all of our interhuman relationship, whether as Amandeep talked about the relationship within government and the citizen, whereas the trust has very demonstrably been needed over the past couple of years to make sure that citizens are able to endorse, believe, and then act on sort of COVID information that the governments have been giving them. And that clearly varied drastically and dramatically from country to country. Similarly, in international relations, in disarmament, as Izumi was saying, I think we struggle, I think, currently in terms of geopolitics in building not rebuilding the framework, as you said earlier, Robin. I think this is a continuous effort, not a one-off thing that needs to be done. And the digital world adds new challenges effectively. In international relations, for example, it's much more difficult to see and understand what states are doing. And that's where confidence building measures, traditional ones, and then we need new ones between states, and then between states and private sector actors are something that needs to be elaborated on. I think the one thing for me, and obviously it manifests itself and can be tested and tried in the digital world differently. I'm sure we're going to talk about it, but authenticity and reliability and all of security, all of privacy, all of these things get a different component in an online environment. To think for me that I think was mentioned earlier today, but not emphasized as much as I would have hoped, I think was the real difference the digital world brings is the power that it gives, not just sort of the guarantee, like the organizations that traditionally have guaranteed or were empowered to guarantee trust, such as states, such as international organizations, or even the private sector, but to the individuals. It's not just that the individual is often the target. Individuals, we all need to almost turn our mindset around and become one of those linchpins that actually foster trust. I think nowhere before has there been as much potential power put in the hand of the individual to share accurate or not accurate information. So I think the one thing that I would just keep in mind is, still the vast majority of the digital content is user generated, and we need to shift to start engaging as individuals on how we actually interact and generate trust with that content. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Kaya. And, I think we all share this almost overwhelming sense of complexity that we feel when dealing with this notion of trust. As I said, it's inherently difficult to grasp. And I think I also agree with you. I'm not sure we need the digital qualifier here. I think we were testing the waters a little bit, also provoking interventions from your side, our speakers. I'm not sure there really is a distinction between trust and digital trust. And maybe it's even the case that when thinking of the digital ecosystem, the anonymity that it brings, the speed with which we communicate in the digital sphere, that, as a counterweight to that, we need to revert to rather traditional measures of trust building, more localized measures of trust building. Just an idea. Let's see. Amandeep, I have a specific question to you, and that follows right in the shoes of what was just said. So what are the challenges to preserving and fostering digital trust? What initiatives can be taken by the international community? How can we make them inclusive? And at the end of the day, build digital trust and mitigate the potential destabilizing effects that digital technologies can, of course, also have.
Thanks, Robin. Maybe just to link back to what you said about local level trust. So I think the issue is hierarchies of trust. So again, with COVID, we've seen that people trusted the local general physician or someone close to them sometimes much more than government messages. They trusted WHO messages. So we need to work on these hierarchies of trust. So I think this is a consequence of the digital age in some ways, but it's just also a very human tendency given the connectivity across the globe today. Now, you've asked me a tough set of questions about, what can be done to foster trust. In a sense, we need to have more trust brokers and more trusted brokers. So we need to expand, and I think this was mentioned before, need the institutions, the platforms where trust can be mediated. A lot of digital platforms, the big digital companies are almost automating this through consent management where, sometimes consent and data sharing are fused together. Now we need to move to a new era in which individuals have more agency over what they are signing up for, what they are sharing, etc. So they start to trust these platforms much more than before. We also need to bring in more interdisciplinarity into the trust brokers. So the institutions, whether they are multilateral institutions or other institutions, multi-stakeholder institutions, they need to expand to take in the private sector, to take in academia, to take in civil society. And your point about inclusiveness, lower the barriers to entry into policy discussions. I have often seen discussions around digital health, for example, or AI in health, where frankly the perspective of the use cases on the ground is missing. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Who are the stakeholders around that problem? So I think lowering those barriers, so bringing in more diversity into those conversations. And then frankly, I think in a very intergovernmental sense, there is role for governments to really pick up the pace and do more in terms of clarifying the application of norms, in terms of building capacity around responding to certain events and incidents, in terms of attribution to certain things so that we have clarity about what's happening. Otherwise, in that kind of an ambiguous situation, the bad actors can exploit that to generate mistrust in multilateral organizations, in the UN, or in governments and responsible private sector players. So I think it's all of those. And frankly, if I was to just point to three ways to organize this, one is interdisciplinarity, bringing in different actors together. The other is a tiered application, this hierarchies of trust, tiered norms. And the third one is a modular construction where you start with guiding principles and you build around that and add in aspects around attribution, around response to incidents as the consensus grows. Thanks.
Thank you, Amandeep. And maybe just as a quick follow-up on the point you made that at the governmental level, we need to step it up, really, and I agree. A lot remains to be done. The high level on digital cooperation, they recommended development of a global commitment on digital trust and security and to shape a shared vision. How realistic is that, and how can we achieve that, Amandeep?
I think it's a fairly low-hanging fruit. So it's a global commitment to building digital trust and security. It's in some ways a reiteration of the 11 principles that the first 5 GGs, Izumi mentioned, all 6 of them have worked up to, and the latest one has been, the latest discussions have been very successful. So it's capturing that into a high-level political commitment and then putting some pieces around that in terms of capacity development, attribution, etc. So that, for example, the liability of the private sector is clarified in some cases and some kind of response capacity builds up. We don't have, at this point in time, the political agreement around policing for a UN or a multilateral organization, just as the IEA does on the nuclear side. But I think we can already put in place some political agreements and start building blocks of that kind of capacity in the future. And this is what the fourth recommendation of the UNSG's high-level panel came out with, and now there is the roadmap, and hopefully this would be taken forward.
Thank you. Now, over to Izumi and a few specific questions to you. What role can the UN play in promoting values of trust and ensuring the security and stability of the digital ecosystem? And also, what can the UN do to encourage more inclusive participation in this regard? And last but not least, how can the UN play a leadership role in this regard? Over to you, Izumi.
Thank you, Robin. You know, in not just in the digital sphere, but you know, in all of our global challenges, the key role of the United Nations has always been to foster multilateralism, foster cooperation, and also to facilitate substantive discussions, policy dialogues, and to forge agreements and consensus in often very sensitive or challenging issues. And the cyber issues, the topic of ICTs has been one of those issues. And I think, you know, as I touched on already, this has been really clearly demonstrated over the last 1.5 decades, if you will, where under the auspices of the UN, a series of a group, you know, there have been 5, and then most recent one, the 6th one, the GGEs, have studied and, you know, existing challenges and threats and made recommendations in terms of measures to address those challenges. Now, the most recent process or processes, the further UN processes, one is the Open-Ended Working Group and the 6th GGE, the recent ones, both of them established in 2018, as you know, have, as Amandeep already said, successfully concluded their work, taking, I think, in my view, important steps forward on the topic through adoption of very concrete and I must say quite action-oriented recommendations. So I'm very happy that they have been able to actually make this progress. Now, a second Open-Ended Working Group has just completed its organizational session, and we're now preparing for the substantive session to start in December, of course. In addition to being a convener and a facilitator, which is our role, the UN, I would definitely like to see the UN also playing a role of providing substantive inputs, new ideas, options for addressing these new challenges, in addition to, of course, the political facilitation and being a convener facilitator. And, you know, as you know already, Robin, UNIDIA really is one of those really key instruments within the UN for that purpose. Now, the UN has also utilized, I think, in this area, the convening power to bring stakeholders, you used the word inclusive process, you know, various stakeholders together on this process. One very concrete example was, you know, under the previous Open-Ended Working Group, we organized the first ever really standalone multi-stakeholder event in the context of international security, where I think over 100 states and to be precise, 114 stakeholder representatives actually came together in the UN conference room and discussed ICT threats and ways to address them. And I've heard from both sides, you know, multi-stakeholders and also the government representatives, that they all found that particular discussion to be extremely useful. So way in which inclusivity can be encouraged is through wider outreach, of course, and I think it's very important that by growing a global network over time. So we are, you know, investing in that sort of work in order for us to be able to create such a global network. Not all relevant stakeholders naturally see the UN as a forum, but I think there is increasing interest on the part of the private sector, industry people also, to see the UN as at least a useful forum to come and discuss these things. So we also need to address the traditional perception that states are solely responsible for maintaining international security. Amandeep already mentioned this. Of course, the states indeed, do carry the primary responsibility on issues such as ICTs in the context of international security. Just because this is such an integral part of our societies and all sorts of activities that take place in our society today, other stakeholders have and also must have a key role and also key interest and understanding in securing cyberspace. Perspectives from the private sector, civil society, and academia really contribute, in my view, a very unique and important part of if you will, a collective solution to cybersecurity that the international community is really seeking in also the UN processes as well. So I think we have a challenge also of changing the mindsets and encourage greater recognition of the importance of cooperative and collaborative and inclusive approach in securing cyberspace. Which brings me to my last point. I think beyond continuing to foster, cooperation and multilateralism and also multi-stakeholder approaches, it's important to note that this Secretary General has also taken several key initiatives to promote global digital cooperation. One clear example, as Amandeep already mentioned, high-level panel on digital cooperation, and of course the roadmap. That is quite key. But also, Secretary General launched his agenda for disarmament, in which he placed emphasis on understanding and addressing new generation technologies that pose possible challenges to existing legal, humanitarian, and ethical norms, non-proliferation, and peace and security. So in his agenda, he also undertook a commitment to engage and work with scientists, engineers, and industry to encourage their responsible innovation and responsible application of innovation in science and technology. And I think this is quite important if we are all going to try to make sure that application is for peaceful purposes and not otherwise. Now, he also made a commitment to engage with member states to help foster a culture of accountability and adherence to emerging norms, rules and principles on responsible behavior in cyberspace. And that's the work that we will be focusing on. So all these different pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, I think, will need to come together. And I think that will be one of the important roles that the UN will need to play as we go forward in this key challenge of our time.
Thank you, Izumi, and also for laying out this pretty big puzzle so clearly for us. And it won't come as a surprise if I fully agree that the idea to allow more UN entities to provide substantive input in some of these processes is truly an excellent one. So with that, over to you, Kaya. And I think for you, I have two sets of questions. And again, quite challenging questions, I feel. The first one is trust. What is trust again? Is it a privacy issue? Is it an accountability issue, an anonymity issue, a transparency issue? Is it all of this, or is it something different altogether?
So before I answer that, I actually just want to enthusiastically endorse everything that Amandeep and Izumi were talking about. I think we definitely need more clarity and in sort of the rules of our cyberspace, and particularly welcome the the sort of the statements and interpretation of international law that were published together with the last GGE, which I think was published 2 days ago. So go and check it out. And also really enthusiastically, we participated in the multi-stakeholder meeting that was mentioned. And yes, we want more of that, please. So just wanted to say that. And similarly, the other point that was not mentioned, but we felt was very important was, that earlier this year, and also I think last year on the Security Council, cybersecurity was discussed for the first couple of times, and the importance of up-leveling this to the highest levels of government, I think is also critical. To your question though, I think it's all of this. I think, it is accountability, it is security, it is privacy. I think it's also ethics, and it's also reliability. I think it then depends a little bit on each individual, on how much emphasis you put on any of these concepts in your assessment of whether you trust a particular entity, individual, or organization. Based on your background, based on, for me, I work on cybersecurity, so security is probably higher up the list than some of the other issues. But that is just a personal tick more than anything else. So I would say it's all of this. For me, the other ethics is also a very important. I think I feel lucky, that to be able to work for a company that takes it seriously and takes a principled approach to all of the things that I've just mentioned. We have a ethics committee that looks at the technology as it gets developed and as it gets deployed in what might be a controversial environment. So, and when the committee decides that maybe this is not good for human rights, we do not sell it to the entity in question, for instance. And then we have a set of privacy principles that guide our decision making in terms of every technology-based decision that we make. And so I think those are the things that should be considered as part of what makes trust. And for the private sector, I think it's one of those things where it is a no-brainer a little bit, in particularly for tech companies. I know the gentleman for Twitter earlier talked about the steps the platforms made on disinformation, particularly ahead of the US election, I think, but without regulation. And I think this is largely because you're dependent on trust for your customers. In security, in particular, when there is a big data breach, I think there's surveys out there where if an individual's personal data is breached in a data breach, over 50% of the time they will change the provider. And similarly, it's self-interest to a large degree that drives the engagement to ensure that there is trust in the system as a whole, right? I think we are the providers, we are the operators of the online world in a lot of cases. So in Microsoft's case, the decision to actively engage in the UN discussions on cybersecurity is also an issue of ensuring that this environment remains stable, or as stable as possible, and obviously also that in the process limit the amounts of attacks in this space. So for me, those are kind of core issues at the heart of the trust in the private sector, and hopefully, through multi-stakeholder, private, public, civil society, academia engagement, we can work together to find concrete pathways forward. Whether on the UN and under the UN framework, or through sort of initiatives that kind of live outside it. It's, the Paris Call for Trust and Security, I think, is one that comes to mind, where there's now working groups that have been established under the principles that look at each particular, a challenge. So election security, for example, and governments, industry, civil society come together to create possible good practices to secure that environment. And I think these can over time then feed into the UN processes, which, in all honesty, are probably a little slower. And I think that's where some of the frustration with the industry comes from. But we do need to move, and we do need to move fast, because technology evolves fast. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to work together on finding solutions and sort of investing and continuing to build and rebuild trust, like, day by day.
Thank you very much, Kaya. And I think, you've already covered my follow-on question in a sense, which, of course, given the keen interest that we have in bringing the private sector into these discussions, really was about how can we make the private-public sector relationship work when we're looking to the preservation of trust. And I think that really is something that will stay with us. And again, a process and a lot of work ahead of us to make that happen. But you've covered it already in your answer. So let me move on to my closing question, which again will go to all of the panelists. And perhaps we can start with you, Kaya, on this one. So if we're looking to the future, what are some of the upcoming challenges to digital trust if we think beyond deepfakes? And today, in the course of the discussions, we heard how deepfakes is really just the tip of the iceberg of the AI revolution. So there must be a whole lot of more and potentially challenging trust and stability of the digital ecosystem. And then also, and relatedly, how can we build resilience in the digital ecosystem? I think that's a priority item also for all of us. Kaya, over to you, please.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's the tip of the iceberg. I think it's difficult to say, what will come next. It could be anything. There could be, and it's probably going to be a little bit like deepfakes. A technology created to entertain people, or try and do something positive. It's oftentimes there's ways to twist even the most innocent application into nefarious purposes. And so for me, the deepfakes is just another of the technologies that might be misused and create challenges over time. Others and it's also not the only one that we face today. The sort of the army of bots spreading mis and disinformation there's plenty out there that we need to be addressing. And as a result, I don't think there's one simple solution to actually resolve these challenges. I think we will need to work together, because there will be so many. I think we will need to work together. We will need to work continuously, and I think that's the bit that is, I think, it's very difficult in the online space, because it's never and then at the end of the year we will finish and everything will be resolved, because there is continuous innovation, and there is continuous innovation on behalf of bad actors as well. So I know for us, from a security perspective, you see new and kind of impressive ways to hack and get into systems on a daily basis. They are very creative. So for me, it is a combination of industry taking responsibility, finding ways to use technology to address some of these challenges. Whether it is through, if I think of spyware, which is another one that's been in the news a fair amount, whether it's finding ways to ensure that the really bad actors that clearly abuse human rights are not able to use the power of cloud computing to do their work. I think that can be an action for responsible private sector actors to take. I think there are ways to spot. I think we talked about this earlier. To use technology to spot, for instance, deepfakes, whether it's through, again, cloud-based tools that let the individual know, or sort of automatically using AI again. But I think fundamentally, and at its core, we need to address the fact that technology has evolved with people's ability to deal with the vast amounts of information and be able to discern what is true and what is not true has not kept up. So, and this was said earlier today, I'm not saying anything new, but I think we need to, as a society, across the board, industry, governments, civil society organization, invest in digital literacy. And whether it's finding quizzes and promoting the information that is out there, whether it's about what deepfakes are, how you spot them, whether it's investing in quality journalism and ensuring that the fact that the digital transformation has had a challenging effect on media does not mean that quality journalism goes away. Whether it's finding ways where when people read news online, they have tools available where they can spot or that remind them whether it's from a trustworthy organization or not. I think Microsoft's partnered with an organization called NewsGuard that does similar things. But I think for me, it is more than anything else, effectively a skilling issue, and not as everybody needs to become a deep technologist, but people need to learn. We all need to learn how to wade through the vast amounts of information that are getting thrown at us.
Thank you, Kaya. Digital literacy really was a recurrent theme throughout the day, and thank you very much for underscoring it once again in this concluding panel. And also, I think it's great that you added this, dose of realism and expectation management, so to say, that this will be a lengthy process. And I just think, we've been working on road safety and traffic regulations for decades, and still we're seeing accidents. So I do think we need to approach the topic also with realistic expectations of what can be done. And of course, absolute security is never to be had, and actually probably not a good thing. Amandeep, the same concluding question to you. Future challenges that you anticipate, and what can we do in terms of building more resiliency?
Right. I think in my mind, the first one is this problem of timely detection, attribution. So this red flagging that something is not okay. The first one is this problem of timely detection, attribution. I heard myself. Okay. Something is not okay.
There's some impersonation.
Right.
Here.
So that was probably a genuine fake. And this is not just an AI problem. It's not just a problem for the big social media platforms. It is an issue of concerted action and coming to a consensus on the nature of the information. So we need to kind of work hard on this problem. The second big challenge is a shift from user consent to user agency. We still haven't, this is an issue that makes the big digital companies a little uncomfortable. So let me try and say it as bluntly as I can. I think there is the problem of privacy protection, data protection. We've got regulations around that, EU GDPR, for example. That's good. But we now need to kind of break apart this fusing of data sharing and the consent aspects. So this is about, having more agency over how your data is used. It's going to be a hard one, but I think this is an urgent priority. The third one is around transparency, because we looked at some of these aspects of ethical conduct. We trust some people because we know they won't throw us under the bus. They tell the whole story to us. They don't hide things from us. So I think not just transparency, but also being able to communicate things. One of the things about digital is it levelizes, it democratizes the debate. So you may have, just studied high school biology, but you can debate on Twitter with the professor of epidemiology. And you can't just, as a professor, just throw your PhD at this person. You have to be able to debate. So it's a question of developing new ways of communicating science and data and evidence. So this is not just a journalist problem, it's a science problem, it's an academia problem, it's a general experts problem. So, talking down at people is not going to work. So find new ways of communications, being transparent. And the last thing I'd say is, I think we build trust when we work together on big challenges, when we stand shoulder to shoulder, whether, we are in a sports team, we're trying to score a goal together, or, trying to repair a water body in a village in India. So if in the digital domain, we do not get together beyond the marketplace where people take care of themselves, beyond the international security space where we can trust the UN and UN institutions to keep doing their stuff, there is a space, the SDG space, let's call it, whether it's SDG 3, SDG 4, SDG 16, the climate change crisis. If we cannot get together and use digital technologies to enable our responses to the SDGs challenges, then we won't be able to build that much trust. So I think this collaboration piece, I think Izumi, you mentioned that, and I think Kai, you talked about the private sector working together with the public sector. So these kind of broader collaboration, these kind of moonshots, whether it's solving the pandemic surveillance problem, or it is building the next generation of chatbots that can address the 18 million health worker shortage. So those are the kind of areas that would, we can work, we have differences on the cybersecurity side, but we can put together our resources around compute capacity, around algorithmic expertise and data sources together at the service of a larger cause. Thanks.
Thank you, Amandeep. And over to you, Izumi, your take on future challenges and how we can build better resiliency in the digital ecosystem.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think there are many, future challenges, of course, but acceleration in the developments of artificial intelligence and also quantum computing capabilities. And I think some of those things will be also led by and then heavily invested also by state infrastructures as well. So some of those will obviously, start to pose additional challenges. For example, on the, sort of a potential or risk of breaking encryption protocols, etc. So I think there will be additional challenges that we need to make sure that we are on alert and be actually thinking about. But in order for all of us to be able to build resilience, as you put it, in the digital space, first of all, we all acknowledge that it's a huge task and it's not something that we could do overnight. It will be a process. And it will have to be a concerted process where, international cooperation and multi-stakeholder cooperation will be really focusing, our respective efforts and energy into. But let me offer perhaps two things as an initial response, where we can already start doing. And one is the implementation. You might actually say that, the progress in international discussions are very slow. But this said, I think we do have something that we can start to really focus to implement. So far it's been discussions, coming up with various recommendations. But I think it's about time that we put our, heads together and efforts together so that they will actually be, implemented and then start to see some impact through that implementation. The most recent results, one from Open-Ended Working Group, the other sets of recommendations and agreements, all of those things were adopted by consensus. They actually range from measures on, measures and principles guiding capacity building efforts, insights on how states can implement voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior in the use of ICTs. There are some quite detailed recommendations and suggestions on how to go about this. So I think it's, there is a wealth of actions suggested by those two multilateral processes recently concluded. So let us all, work towards, how we might be able to improve the implementation of that. So I think this is one thing, focus on implementation. The second, turning to the other I, which is inclusivity, which came up many times during our conversations today. I've already mentioned that we need to do more to ensure multi-stakeholder approach to digital security, and I think we all agree to that. It's been found that 90% of security incidents result from exploits against defects in software. So, it's very clear to me, if we were to address this, we need the help of software developers, engineers, and researchers. So it really has to go, to the next level of depth, if you will, in terms of multi-stakeholder cooperation and inclusiveness. And another thing, because it hasn't come up yet, I need to, put it here, is the inclusivity through a gender lens as well. We need to make sure that, we continue to improve equal access and also space for men and women to influence our digital world. And to me, this is a very, very important priority. And it's a priority because we have a really rich evidence, from the past that chances of making something sustainable, for example, peace agreement sustainable, are much higher and much more sustainable if women were able to exercise their strong influence over the process. So, the same will apply to digital security, digital cooperation as well. So ensuring the full and equal participation of women is not just a right approach, but it is a smart and really effective one. I wanted to also emphasize. Same goes for, and with a huge emphasis on young people. We all know, you talked about literacy, but young people are the digital natives. The statistics show that globally, over 22% of professional software developers are between the ages of 18 and 24. Can you imagine? And over 50% of them are between the ages of 25 and 34. So this really is a factual, really demonstration that we have to, construct the processes of tackling those challenges in such a way, in much more inclusive way, so that people from the young generation who actually create those capacities in the world will be really contributing in a meaningful and a substantive manner. And that would mean a lot in terms of securing digital stability and peace. So I think those are some of the other aspects of inclusivity beyond multi-stakeholderness. And I think we need to make sure, as the United Nations, we're not necessarily good at those considerations, but I think this is a clear sort of operational requirements if we are to get serious about making the processes work. So those are some of my initial suggestions.
Thank you, Izumi, and I really liked the point and how you phrased it about reaching the next level of depth in multi-stakeholder engagement and inclusivity, which is, I think, part of that. That concludes the panel. In fact, we've overstepped by a couple of minutes here, but that's only fair given the extremely inspiring and insightful reflections we've heard from our three panelists this afternoon. Now, will the audience please join me in a round of virtual and physical applause for our panelists? Thank you so very much.